We don't believe that we don't know that Putin has made up his mind to use force, but what we do know is that he's putting the Russian military, the Russian security services in a place where they could act in a pretty sweeping way. But, Ukraine is an issue that he's made no secret in public over the course of recent years of the significance that he and much of the Russian elite attach to their view that they ought to have significant influence over Ukraine's choices. Our view as a policy matter is obviously to, continue unwavering support for Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence. But I would never underestimate President Putin's risk appetite on Ukraine. I think tactically, as President Putin probably looks at this winter, at the next few months, he may see a more favorable landscape, with major European allies who are, in his eyes, distracted with the transition beyond Chancellor Merkel in Germany, French elections coming up next year. He, sees himself in a position of relative economic strength compared to where the Russian economy was a couple of years ago. So it's not like Russia's 10 feet tall, but he may see this winter tactically as offering a kind of favorable landscape. And as I said, none of that means that he's going to act militarily. I don't think that's a foregone conclusion at all, but that's why it's so important to respond to that with a pretty strong mix of deterrence as well as the possibility of diplomacy.
In this video, I'm going to be explaining two issues that will help redefine and better understand the Russian-Ukraine conflict. One of which is the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances, and the other is the recent leak by Wikileaks regarding NATO expansionism eastward, which would entice Russia to react militarily. What did the CIA know? I have to give credit to Ed Brotherton, who put me on last night in a Zoom call about the Budapest Memorandum. And I'm not going to read the whole memorandum. I'm going to share some news articles and documents with you at the bottom of the description for you to read at your leisure. I will generally summarize the memorandum, which included security assurances against threats or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, which, as a result of other agreements and memorandum between 1993 and 96, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons. But before they did, Ukraine had the third largest nuclear weapons stockpile. But Ukraine did not have physical or operational control. Russia controlled the codes needed to operate the nuclear weapons through their electronic permissive action links and the Russian command and control system, although this could not be sufficient guarantee against Ukrainian access. Formally, these weapons were controlled by the Commonwealth of Independent States, which are a regional intergovernmental organization located in Eastern Europe and Asia, which was formed following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Belarus only had mobile missile launchers, and Kazakhstan quickly chose to return the nuclear warheads and missiles to Russia, while Ukraine went through a period of internal debate on how to approach this issue. On May 23rd, 1992, Russia, the United States, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine signed the Lisbon Protocol to the START I Treaty. START I Treaty was a bilateral treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union on the reduction and limitation of strategic offensive arms. The treaty was signed on July 31st, 1981, and entered into force on December 5th of 1994. The protocol committed Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine to adhere to the nuclear prolific treaty as non-nuclear weapon states as soon as possible. However, the terms for the transfer of the nuclear warheads were not agreed, and some Ukrainian officials and parliamentarians started to discuss the possibility of retaining some of the modern Ukrainian-built RT-23 missiles and Russian-built warheads. The following year, 2 regiments of UR-100N missiles in the Ukraine were withdrawn to storage because warhead components were past their operational life, and Ukraine's political leadership realized that Ukraine could not become a credible nuclear military force as they could not maintain the warheads and ensure long-term nuclear safety. Later in 1993, the Ukrainian and Russian governments signed a series of bilateral agreements giving up Ukrainian claims to the nuclear weapons and the Black Sea Fleet in return for $2.5 billion in gas and oil debt cancellation and future supplies of fuel for its nuclear power reactors. Ukraine agreed to ratify the START I and nuclear proliferation treaties promptly. This caused severe public criticism, and Ukrainian Defense Minister Konstantin Petrov Morozov, had resigned. Later in December of '93, Vice President Al Gore visited Moscow for a pre-planned meeting in which, following discussions between a U.S. and Russian delegation, including U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense William Perry, who flew to Ukraine to agree to the outlines of a trilateral agreement, including U.S. assistance in dismantling the nuclear systems in the Ukraine and compensation for the uranium and nuclear warheads. President Clinton made a courtesy stop at Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, on his way to Moscow for the trilateral statement signing, only to discover Ukraine was having second thoughts about signing, to which Clinton told Kravchuk that not signing would risk major damage to U.S.-Ukraine relations. After some minor rewarding, trilateral statement was signed by the 3 presidents in Moscow in front of the media on January 14th, 1994. Fast forward to 2009, in which Russia and the United States released a joint statement that the memorandum's security assurances would still be respected after the expiration of the START treaty. But after the annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014, U.S. coalition partners, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, stated that Russian involvement was a breach of its Budapest Memorandum obligations to Ukraine, which had transmitted to the United Nations under the signature of Sergei Lavrov and others, and a violation of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. But on March 4, 2014, the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, replied to a question on the violation of the Budapest Memorandum, describing the current Ukrainian situation as a revolution. A new state arises. But with this state and respect to this state, we have not signed any obligatory documents. Later, Russia stated that it had never been under obligation to force any part of Ukraine's civilian population to stay in Ukraine against its will. Russia also suggested that the United States was in violation of the Budapest Memorandum and described the Euromaidan as a U.S.-instigated coup. Now, I've described the Euromaidan in previous videos. The Euromaidan was a wave of demonstrations and civil unrest in Ukraine, which began on the night of November 21st, 2013, with public protests in Kiev, in which the protests were sparked by the Ukrainian government's sudden decision not to sign the European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement, and instead choosing closer ties to Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union. The Eurasian Economic Union is located in Eastern Europe, in which post-Soviet states are co-signers: Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Russia. Treaties aiming for Armenia's and Kyrgyzstan's ascension to the Eurasian Union were signed in the following year. Not to mention, Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko now was seen as a Russian puppet. But was he? The scope of the protests had widened with calls of resignation for the president, Viktor Yanukovych, and the Azarov government. Protests opposed the way they saw as widespread government corruption and the influence of oligarchs. However, Yanukovych was basically seen as too friendly with Russia. During this time, the protests began to be more violent. Following the Euromaidan protests, we saw the 2014 revolution, which followed, called the Revolution of Dignity, which took place in February 2014 at the end of the Euromaidan protests, when a series of violent events which saw 80 policemen being killed by outside forces, mainly foreigners and neo-Nazi regiments. Now, I've done a video and a special podcast with Richard Cox regarding how the CIA trained neo-Nazi regiments from Ukraine inside the United States and in the Ukraine in the months following the Euromaidan protests. Now, according to the Budapest Memorandum, Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom confirmed their recognition of Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine becoming parties to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, effectively abandoning their nuclear arsenal to Russia. And they both agreed that, one, respect Belarusian, Kazakhstan, and Ukrainian independence and sovereignty in the existing borders with the existing governments. Two, refrain from the threat or the use of force against Belarus, Kazakhstan, or Ukraine. Three, refrain from using economic pressure on Belarus, Kazakhstan, or Ukraine to influence their politics. Four, seek immediate Security Council action to provide assistance to Belarus, Kazakhstan, or Ukraine if they should become a victim of an act of aggression or an object of a threat of aggression in which nuclear weapons are used. Five, refrain from the use of nuclear arms against Belarus, Kazakhstan, or Ukraine. And finally, six, consult with one another if questions arise regarding those commitments. With the latest events regarding Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it would seem that they willfully abandoned their commitment regarding the memorandum. However, in a BBC article on May 20th, 2014, headliner, Russia does not guarantee the integrity of Ukraine. Quote, Russia cannot and is not going to guarantee the territorial integrity of Ukraine since it has never taken on such obligations, according to Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, which he said in an interview with Bloomberg News. He would go on to say, we do not have to guarantee anything to anyone because we have never assumed any obligations on this subject, but we proceed from the fact that the most important task is to calm the situation on the territory of Ukraine, not to guarantee something to someone, but to calm the situation. At the same time, according to Medvedev, statements about Russia's intention to annex any part of Ukraine are propaganda. In comparison with the situation in Crimea is inappropriate. But what did the United States know? Well, according to WikiLeaks' latest document release, headliner, Nayet meets Nayet, Russians' NATO enlargement Redlines. This document was filed on February 1st of 2008, well before the revolutions, the protests, and the military invasion of the Ukraine. This comes on a document signed by former Russian U.S. ambassador and current CIA director William J. Burns. Summary. Following a muted first reaction to Ukraine's intent to seek a NATO membership action plan at the Bucharest summit, Foreign Minister Lavrov and other senior officials have reiterated strong opposition, stressing that Russia would view further eastward expansion of NATO as a potential military threat. NATO enlargement, particularly to Ukraine, remains an emotional and neurologic issue for Russia, but strategic policy considerations also underlie strong opposition to NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia. In Ukraine, these include fears that the issue could potentially split the country in two, leading to violence or even some claim civil war, which would force Russia to decide whether to intervene. Additionally, the GOR and experts continue to claim that Ukrainian NATO membership would have a major impact on Russia's defense industry, Russian-Ukrainian family connections, and bilateral relations generally. In Georgia, the GOR fears continued instability and provocative acts in the separatist regions. Point 5, Russian opposition, neurologic and concrete. Ukraine and Georgia's NATO aspirations not only touch a raw nerve in Russia, they engender serious concerns about the consequences for stability in the region. Not only does Russia perceive encirclement and efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences which would seriously affect Russian security interests. Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of the ethnic Russian community against membership, could lead to a major split involving violence or, at worst, civil war. In that, eventually, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to have to face. Comment near the end. Russia's opposition to NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia is both emotional and based on perceived strategic concerns about the impact on Russia's interest in the region. It is also politically popular to paint the US and NATO as Russia's adversaries and to use NATO's outreach to Ukraine and Georgia as a means of generating support from Russian nationalists. While Russian opposition to the first round of NATO's enlargement in the mid-1990s was strong, Russia now feels itself able to respond more forcefully to what it perceives as actions contrary to its national interests. End transmission. So, with that document dated in 2008, it seems that the current CIA director, who was then the former US-Russian ambassador, saw that NATO expansionism would lead Russia to make a decision on Ukraine. Yushchenko did not want to sign Ukraine into NATO membership. As a result, just as the document states, a civil war took place, which had elements of CIA involvement regarding training and arming Russian, Ukrainian separatists and neo-Nazi groups, which are basically at war in Donbass, which is the republics of Lushensk and Donetsk, which gained independence from Ukraine and which Russia absorbed. Not everything the media tells you is true, but not everything are lies. Most of it is missing and misleading. And for those who are generally ignorant about the conflict, which I basically am, we could still get to the truth because we could do our due diligence and research and study, but we would have to do it without a preconceived mindset regarding human constructs. In this case, politics. Turn off the TV, turn off the radio, get on the internet to look for independent media and to look for as much documentation as you can that doesn't support a narrative favoring Ukraine, Russia, or the United States, but instead favors the truth.